Imagine being the first person to ever commit murder. No courtroom, no police, no witnesses, just two brothers, an open field, and a single devastating moment that would echo through every generation of human history. Abel's blood is soaking into the ground. Cain stands alone, the world's first killer, the world's first liar, the world's first fugitive. And yet, what God does next is perhaps the most theologically startling moment in all of Scripture. He doesn't execute Cain, he marks him. What was that mark? That question has haunted scholars, theologians, philosophers, and ordinary human beings for thousands of years. And today, we are going to descend into the linguistic depths of the Hebrew language, excavate the ancient traditions of Jewish rabbis, walk through the reflections of early church fathers, and confront the darkest misinterpretations this passage has ever been subjected to. Because at the end of this journey, you will discover that the mark of Cain was never just about him. It has always been about us. Genesis chapter 4 opens with what appears to be a simple offering. Cain, a farmer, and Abel, a shepherd, both bring sacrifices before God. Abel brings the firstborn of his flock, the finest, the most costly, the most personal. Cain brings some of the fruit of the ground. The text does not say he brought the worst, but it does say something profoundly different from what Abel offered, and God saw the difference. God accepted Abel's offering. He did not accept Cain's. Now pause here, because this rejection was not arbitrary. The letter to the Hebrews tells us that Abel offered his sacrifice by faith. The ancient Jewish tradition understood that the quality of an offering reflected the condition of the heart behind it. Abel gave his best because he loved God. Cain gave what was convenient, and God, who searches the heart, responds to what is behind the hand, not merely what is in it. Cain's face fell, his anger burned, and here, in this precise, agonizing moment, something extraordinary happens that most people overlook entirely. God himself speaks directly to Cain before the murder. He does not ignore him. He does not abandon him. He comes to him with a personal warning. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. That phrase, sin crouching at the door, is one of the most psychologically profound images in all of ancient literature. The Hebrew verb used here, rovetz, is the same word used for an animal lying in ambush, a predator coiled and waiting. God was telling Cain that the darkness was real, that the temptation had a will of its own, and that Cain still had the power to choose. This was a divine intervention of mercy before the catastrophe. God gave Cain every opportunity to turn back. Cain made his choice. He said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. The text is devastatingly spare. No dramatic build-up in the narrative, no lengthy description, just the blunt, irreversible weight of 7 words. The first murder in human history happened in a quiet field, with no witnesses except the God who sees all things. Then the voice of God descended like thunder. "Where is Abel, your brother?" And Cain, standing over the body of his own flesh and blood, looked into the face of the eternal God and said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" The arrogance of that answer has echoed through every civilization that has ever tried to evade moral accountability. It was the first human attempt to deny responsibility before God. But God did not argue. He did not debate. He simply said, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." The Hebrew word used here is extraordinary, tsa'akot, crying out, screaming, a desperate plea for justice. And the word for blood, dam, is used in its plural form in this verse, damim, which many scholars interpret as representing not just Abel's blood, but all the future generations who would have descended from him. Cain did not merely kill one man, He silenced an entire lineage. He erased a world of potential human life before it could breathe. God then pronounces the curse. The ground, which had already received Abel's blood, would no longer yield its strength to Cain. The earth itself would reject the hands of the man who would use them to destroy life. And beyond that, Cain would become a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. In Hebrew, na v'nad. Na, one who staggers, who cannot find rest. Nad, one who wanders without destination, driven by restlessness that finds no relief. This was not merely a geographic sentence. This was a spiritual condition. Exile from peace, from belonging, from the settled presence of God. Cain heard this and cried out, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." And now, the most theologically stunning moment in this entire story. God responds not with good or so be it or silence. God responds with protection. Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would strike him down. The mark of Cain was a sign of divine protection placed upon a confessed murderer. Let that land with its full weight. The first man ever to commit murder was not executed. He was marked. He was protected. God extended to the most guilty man in human history a shield that no human hand could rightfully remove. Why? Because God was making a declaration not just about Cain, but about the nature of justice itself. Now let us enter the linguistic and historical excavation that this passage demands. The Hebrew word translated as mark is ot, aleph, vav, tav. This is one of the most significant words in the entire Hebrew Bible. Ot means sign, token, or symbol. It is the same word used in Genesis 9 when God sets the rainbow in the sky as a sign of his covenant with Noah. It is the same word used when circumcision is called a sign of the Abrahamic covenant. It is used throughout the Torah to describe the miraculous signs Moses performed before Pharaoh. An ot is never a random marking. It is always a divinely appointed symbol that communicates a specific theological message. The mark on Cain was not a brand like cattle receive. It was an ot, a sign from God with meaning, purpose, and power embedded within it. The text does not specify what form this ot took, and it is precisely in that silence that centuries of interpretation have proliferated like branches from an ancient tree. The Talmud and various midrashic traditions offer multiple remarkable possibilities. One tradition, found in the Midrash Rabbah, suggests that God caused Cain to tremble, that a perpetual visible shaking overtook his body, and this trembling became his mark, his warning to others that something divine had intervened in his story. Another ancient tradition holds that God gave him a horn, not as a punishment, but as a visible sign of divine protection, something that would command recognition wherever he traveled. A particularly beautiful tradition suggests that God sent a dog to walk with Cain, a guardian companion whose very presence served as a visible sign of divine care. And perhaps the most theologically rich of all the rabbinic interpretations recorded in the Midrash is the tradition that God inscribed a letter of his own holy name on Cain's forehead, because the name of God itself is protection.
To bear even a single letter of the divine name was to carry a shield that no mortal weapon could penetrate. Among the early Christian thinkers, Origen suggested that the mark was not necessarily physical at all, that it may have been a spiritual grace, an invisible but real divine protection that altered the spiritual atmosphere around Cain. Augustine, in his monumental work, The City of God, interpreted the mark through the lens of Cain's entire existence, his restlessness, his exile, his continued life in the midst of judgment. Augustine saw Cain's ongoing survival as itself a sign to the world, a living testimony to both the consequences of sin and the restraint of divine vengeance. Now we must address the darkest chapter in the interpretation of this text, because intellectual honesty and theological integrity demand it. In the 17th and 18th centuries, in the context of the transatlantic slave trade and the ideology of racial hierarchy, certain interpreters who sought religious justification for their exploitation of other human beings claimed that the mark of Cain was a change in skin color. They argued that God made Cain's skin dark as a punishment, and that black people were therefore the cursed descendants of Cain. This interpretation was not merely wrong, it was a catastrophic abuse of sacred text. It was theological violence deployed in service of human evil. There is not a single word in the Hebrew of Genesis 4 that describes any change in physical appearance, much less in skin color. No ancient Jewish source, no early church father, no legitimate biblical scholar across any era has ever derived such a reading from this text. It was a fabrication manufactured to sanctify oppression, and it must be named, condemned, and permanently buried. The mark of Cain has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with mercy. And that brings us to the most profound theological truth concealed within this ancient story. Why did God protect Cain? The answer is not that God was soft on sin. God's curse was severe. The loss of belonging, the exile from the land, the severing of relationship with the ground. These were devastating consequences. But God refused to allow human vengeance to become the instrument of Cain's death. And the reason is embedded in what he said: "Whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." God was not merely protecting Cain, he was making a statement about who controls justice in the universe. If Cain had been killed in retaliation, his son would have avenged him, and that killer's clan would have avenged their fallen, and the cycle would have cascaded through generations, violence begetting violence, blood answering blood, the earth soaked in an endless river of human retribution. God interrupted that cycle before it could begin. He said, in effect, "Vengeance belongs to me, not to you. Justice is my domain. You do not have the authority to repay evil with evil on your own terms." This is not a comfortable truth. It is a terrifying one, because it means that even the worst people among us, even those who have done the most irreversible harm, exist within a justice that is ultimately God's to administer and not ours to usurp. This does not mean God excuses sin. He cursed Cain. He confronted him. He never said what Cain did was acceptable, but he also never surrendered his sovereignty over the timing and nature of ultimate judgment. The mark of Cain is therefore a symbol of divine restraint, and divine restraint is one of the most radical expressions of God's sovereignty that Scripture contains. It is the declaration that God does not need human instruments to execute his justice. He will do it, in his time, in his way. But there is one more layer to this story that reaches across every century and lands directly at your feet. This story was never just about Cain. It was never merely a historical account of the first family's first tragedy. It is the story of every human soul that has ever walked away from God's warning and into the field of irreversible choice. We all know what it feels like to have that moment, when God speaks to the deepest part of us and says, "Sin is crouching at the door, but you can still rule over it." And then to feel ourselves walking toward the field anyway. We all know the weight of standing before God after something we cannot undo, and trying to compose some version of "I don't know" when he asks us where our brother is. We have all, in ways small and shattering, been Cain. We have all carried something we were afraid would destroy us if exposed. And here is the radical, almost unbearable truth of this ancient story. The same God who cursed Cain also marked him. The same God who confronted his sin also covered his life. The same God who allowed him to feel the full weight of his choices also refused to let him be destroyed by the retaliation he deserved. That is not weakness. That is the terrifying, magnificent coexistence of justice and mercy that runs like a spine through the entire biblical narrative, from Genesis to Revelation. The mark of Cain is not the mark of damnation. It is the mark of God's refusal to abandon even the guilty to the chaos of human vengeance. It is proof that even in the darkest moment, even after the most devastating choice, God's presence does not simply evaporate. It transforms, it restrains, it waits. If you are carrying something today, a choice that cannot be undone, a weight that has followed you like a shadow, a version of yourself that you are afraid God has already condemned, then hear this. The God who walked toward Cain in the aftermath of history's first murder, who did not destroy him but marked him with protection, who refused to surrender his sovereignty over justice even when Cain deserved none of his mercy, that God has not changed. The same sovereign hand that moved in that field is moving still. The real question this story places before every generation is not, what was the mark? The question is, when God comes to you in the moment before the field, when sin is crouching at the door and you still have the power to rule over it, what will you choose? Because that moment is the one that defines everything that comes after.